And a big congratulations to the RSSTI team led by Dr. Bansi Sabu, Dr. Sanjay Agarwal, Dr. Vasant Kumar, and all of them, and also the scientific committee for such an excellent scientific program, and also for giving me an opportunity to be part of it and to open the session with Mitochondrion. I think this is this should be the Saraswati Vandana for any cardiometabolic conference now in future. So as we shall see, let me share my slides, right, that the mitochondrion plays a very important role, as we all understand from our physiology days. So we will try and go back a little bit and also possibly look forward as to how we can use the mitochondrion to our benefit. So the term that was used was globesity, which is, let me go to, which is, of course, representing global obesity or the very high prevalence of obesity across the world. And how does mitochondrion play a role there? Well, we all know the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, because that is where ATP, the energy currency of the cell, is produced through oxidative phosphorylation. However, if the electron transport chain through which has to be normally functioning in order to produce ATP, if it doesn't function properly, then there is generation of reactive oxygen species or leading to oxidative stress, which, however, is not only of pathological significance, has also physiological use within the cells. And then there is apoptosis, which again is required for normal functioning of any organ, because you need to have old inefficient cells being taken off the circulation and new cells have to take their place. However, if you have this going on beyond a certain stage, then you have disease also. So just as the beta cells, maybe we used to think at least that they tend to undergo apoptosis, and therefore in course of time, even in type 2 diabetes, most patients will require insulin. So these are the three main functions of the mitochondria: producing ATP, generating reactive oxygen species, and a regulation of apoptosis. However, if we try to look back, you have to look back 2 to 3 billion years ago, when mitochondria were first introduced into eukaryotic cells. And that was as endosymbiosis of aerobic bacteria. And as time passed, means hundreds of thousands of years passed, mitochondria transferred most of the genes to the nucleus, but still retain circular mitochondrial DNA. Usually there are a number of copies of this DNA, and they give rise to at least several important peptides. Now, we all know that excess calorie intake, chronic high-fat diet, lack of exercise, intrauterine malnutrition, and also various environmental pollutants can lead to insulin resistance. What we now know is that most of this can now be explained by mitochondrial dysfunction leading to excessive reactive oxygen species generation. And we know ROS can damage proteins, lipids, as well as DNA. And this DNA could be the mitochondrial DNA itself, or it could be nuclear DNA. So this is the importance of knowing about the mitochondrion. However, the mitochondrion is quite often not talked much about. It's like the elephant in the room that is never seen. It is only relatively recently, in 2005, that Lowell and Schulman, in their landmark viewpoint article in the Science journal, first provided a unifying hypothesis of type 2 diabetes arising from the mitochondrion. arising from mitochondrial dysfunction. So it could explain not only insulin resistance, majorly at the skeletal muscle, but also could explain impaired pancreatic beta cell function. So this happened only in 2005. And we now understand that mitochondrial dysfunction could not only explain the genesis of diabetes type 2, it could also explain the complications developing from type 2 diabetes. And we all know that living organisms do have the capacity to adapt. But there is a limitation to which we can adapt. There will be a point beyond which the system can no longer adapt. Then it becomes maladaptive, and then you see the start of pathology. So quickly, we will talk a little bit of the type 2 diabetes, its relation to obesity and the clinical challenges, especially in relation to India, and then talk about the metabolic inflexibility or meta-inflexibility, which could explain not only type 2 diabetes, but also the vascular complications of the disease, and then possibly leave you with some thoughts as to how we could better approach management of type 2 diabetes, think anew about treatment by addressing the mitochondrion. And I'm sure Dr. Krishna Chowdhury will take us forward in that direction. So we know diabetes is important, not only because of the numbers, but also because it's fraught with excess mortality. Diabetes accounted for, this was from 2017, almost 4 million excess deaths and $727 billion in health spending. And so it's a costly disease to manage. And if you look at our own country and look at our map, our obesity map, let us say, of over 25 years from 1990 on the left to 2016 on the right, we find the colors changing, not political colors, representing light blue as a minimum low prevalence of obesity and red as high prevalence of obesity. So even without going into the details, what strikes you is that the oranges and the reds have significantly increased even in our country, even where we talk of malnutrition. We just heard about tribals not having access to food. But overall, the picture is one of overnutrition, of overweight and obesity even in our country. And we know the prevalence is high. We know the current estimates of not only 77 million, actually current estimate will be higher than that, at least more than 80 million people with diabetes in our country. So it's a huge burden. And we, however, do also understand that BMI, high BMI, could explain almost about 35% of the occurrence of diabetes. So obesity is very intricately related to occurrence of type 2 diabetes. And then, of course, we do understand it's not just BMI which can tell us about obesity, it's the body fat percentage. And this is a slide we have seen nth number of times, but still it is relevant. Our own Chittaranjan Yagnik and John Yudkin from Oxford. So our Dr. Yagnik, of course, is from Pune. Both have the same BMI, 22.3, impressive, quite normal BMI. But if you look at the fat content, this was by DEXA, the fat content is almost 2.5 times in Chittaranjan Yagnik. And not only is there more fat amongst us Indians, there is also more fat deposition within the abdominal cavity around the viscera, so-called visceral adiposity. And this adds further problems because this, we know, is related to low levels of adiponectin. We know this is related to leptin resistance, all of which can give rise to inflammatory state, can give rise to insulin resistance. Now, we all know that the basic fundamental management of a disease like type 2 diabetes or cardiometabolic disorders should be lifestyle. Yes, of course, because it is partly at least lifestyle disorder. However, if you look at the evidence, this is from the very famous Look Ahead study. which try to employ strict lifestyle intervention in people with diabetes and try and improve cardiovascular health. However, despite the efficiency of weight loss, which is very remarkable, the top one is control and the lower one is high intensive lifestyle intervention group, there was significant weight loss, but even over a period of 9.5 years, there wasn't significant reduction of cardiovascular events. So there is something else possibly that we are missing. Maybe we should have maybe intervened even earlier than this. And then we have the wonder molecules of the 20th century, the statins, which have done wonders, are still doing wonders, whether in primary prevention or in secondary prevention. They do reduce cardio, and we may skip this. And we also know that despite the use of statins, despite escalation of dose, there is still about 15% event rate despite use of statins. So clearly, these are great advances, but there is more to do, more to go ahead with. And then we also need to remember that statins, despite their benefits and despite their evident cardiovascular protection action, they are also associated not only with new onset diabetes, but also progression of diabetes in those who already have got the disease. Whether you define in terms of the acute hyperglycemic emergencies that they have, or worsening of glucose control, or need for additional classes of anti-diabetic drugs, or use of insulin, all of these have been shown to be adversely affected in this large retrospective cohort study, including 83,000 propensity score matched pairs of statin users versus non-users. So we turn back, so we come back to the mitochondrial, remind ourselves of these tiny organelles inside the cells, which have an outer membrane, which have an intermembranous space, and then there's the inner membrane, which is thrown into folds, the cristae, on which essentially increases the surface area, so increases the efficiency of these organelles itself. So this is what we shall look at. And why is it important? Because they are normally, so the mitochondria normally have this ability to switch between fuels. During fasting phase, where glucose is at a premium, the mitochondrial smoothly and efficiently switches to using free fatty acids. Whereas in the fed state, when there is more glucose coming into the circulation from the gastrointestinal tract, it then switches back to using glucose as the main ATP generator. This alternate switching is something that we take for granted. However, in somebody who is obese, in someone who is chronically overfed with carbohydrates or even with fats, this switching is lost, and therefore comes in the question of mitochondrial or metabolic inflexibility, which is the sort of heart of the matter. And we don't need to go into all these basics. I wish you to remember that we understand what is the main fuel that is being used by the mitochondrion or by the cell by looking at RQ, or the respiratory quotient, which is essentially a ratio between carbon dioxide production and oxygen consumption, which fluctuates between 0.7 to 1. A high, nearer 1, RQ, indicates that the cells are utilizing glucose primarily, whereas a low, meaning more towards 0.7, means that the cells are utilizing primarily fat oxidation. And we now understand that eventually, if the system is deranged because of chronic overnutrition, or even possibly because of lack of exercise, there are morphological changes that happen in the mitochondrion, and also there are functional changes, so that the mitochondria sort of no longer know which fuel to use when, rather they continue to oxidize a fixed mixture of fats and carbohydrates regardless of the nutritional context. This is a very important dysfunctional state that we need to understand. And if we could somehow make the mitochondria understand what to use when, possibly we will do a whole lot of good to the metabolic health of the cell and of the individual and of our society. So this blunted fuel switching has now been described in a variety of clinical conditions: obesity, diabetes, heart disease, NASH, polycystic ovarian disease, and all of that, which we understand the running the thread underneath amongst all these is insulin resistance. So this is just a graphical representation. When you have carbohydrate predominant, which is glucose is in gray, fat is in orange or red. So you have high respiratory quotient when carbohydrate mainly is being oxidized, with fat mainly is oxidized, which is the red. The RQ, the respiratory quotient, is low. And so what we understand, especially looking at the look ahead study, is possibly if we just address obese individuals and try and make them lose weight, maybe we will not be able to achieve the reduction of cardiovascular complications that we would desire. And so we do understand that mitochondrial dysfunction precedes adiposity-mediated cardiovascular complications. So maybe we need to address this mitochondria as well. And we do understand that a mitochondrial dysfunction can affect the skeletal muscle, it can affect adipose tissue, and it can affect the beta cells of the pancreas, apart from being able to affect the heart as well in multiple mechanisms, which we shall not go into the details of at this point of time. And so this is once again a cellular respiration and efficiency is brought about by ideal fuel selection during fast and fed states, which comes for a toss in presence of long-standing obesity. And so if you can make your mitochondria more efficient, then you are able to actually make your skeletal muscle, your pancreas, and your cardiac muscle much more efficient. And so we talk once again about the metabolic inflexibility in obese or in type 2 diabetes patients, and one does not know which one to use at what time, and hence give rise to a whole lot of problems. And another way of looking at glucose efficiency is to look at the cellular respiration and the phosphate to oxygen ratio, or the ATP yield per oxygen atom consumed. And overall, glucose tends to be more efficient than fatty acids. So we would like glucose to be used whenever possible. And we do now understand that mitochondrial dysfunction also does lead to endothelial dysfunction. It also does lead to beta cell dysfunction. And so we maybe sort of try and gather together the knowledge that we have got, that whether environmental factors through obesity, through intrauterine malnutrition, through persistent environmental pollutants, or through genetic factors, which may be at the nuclear DNA level, which could be at the mitochondrial DNA level, they all could affect the mitochondria, affect its functioning, and which could then give rise to both insulin resistance and beta cell dysfunction. And also the third component, which is not shown here, could also give rise to cardiac dysfunction, endothelial dysfunction, and therefore could also explain atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So the summary is we need to have a healthy balance, the ability for the mitochondrion to switch energy pathways of fat and glucose metabolism so that metabolic flexibility is ensured. Mitochondrial modulation, when you have some stress, the mitochondria modulate themselves, try to adapt themselves. That improves bioenergetics, restores metabolic flexibility by acting on the respiratory transport system or the electron transport system inside the mitochondria. But there is a level to which you can ask the mitochondria to modulate. So eventually there is dysfunction, and therefore I think a time has come, despite the availability of wonderful agents, the SGLT2 inhibitors, the GLP-1 analogs, and so on and so forth. I think we need something more specific, more basic to address the mitochondria in order to provide a sort of holistic intervention, not only for diabetes, but also for cardiovascular risk factors. So with these, I would like to stop, and I would like to thank once again the organizers for giving me this opportunity.